Her name was Diane de Poitiers, and she was a living scandal incarnate. Imagine a woman who, at 40, looked 20, and at 60, 30. A woman who was 2 decades older than the king, yet his sole passion, his mentor, and his secret ruler. Courtiers whispered that her eternal youth was the result of a pact with dark forces, and looking at her, it was easy to believe. But the truth turned out to be far more shocking than any rumor of witchcraft. How did this woman manage to bend the monarch's will, turning him into an obedient instrument in her hands? How did she keep his legitimate wife, the powerful Catherine de Medici, in a humiliating position for decades, forcing her to tolerate her presence? And most importantly, what was the secret of her unfading beauty, a secret only uncovered in the 21st century, proving more terrifying than any diabolical deal? This is not a story about love. It is a story about power, brilliant manipulation, and the terrible price Diane de Poitiers had to pay for her triumph. Let us cast aside mysticism immediately. It is too simple, even boring for a figure like Diane. To explain her phenomenon by a deal with otherworldly forces is to demean her own entirely human but no less astonishing genius. The true enigma of Diane de Poitiers lies not in the realm of theology, but in the sphere of psychology, strategy, and, as we shall later discover, cold, almost medical science. To understand this woman, we must see her not as a witch, but as the great architect of her own destiny. She did not wait for gifts from life. She took what she wanted and built her reality according to her own blueprints, using human souls, ambitions, and weaknesses as her material. And the most pliable material in her hands turned out to be the future King of France.
So, the first and main question: how? How did she manage to establish total control over Henry II? It was not a case of simple seduction of a young man by a mature woman. It was a years-long filigree operation of personality formation. Diane did not just become his lover, she became his operating system. She molded his character, his tastes, his political views, implanting her desired ideas into his consciousness under the guise of wise counsel and motherly care. Imagine a brilliant puppeteer so masterful that the puppet genuinely believes it moves on its own. In this complex game, Diane foresaw everything, even the king's relationship with his legitimate wife. She did not wage open war with Catherine de Medici. On the contrary, she acted as their patroness, compelling Henry to fulfill his marital duties so that the dynasty would have heirs. It was a move of truly devilish wisdom. She strengthened the dynasty to strengthen the position of her king, and thus her own power. She transformed the love triangle into a stable political construct where she was the principal load-bearing element. Now let us turn to the mystery of her appearance, which captivated the minds of the entire European court. In a world where a woman at 40 was considered a deep old lady, how did she manage to retain smooth skin, a slender figure, and the energy of a young girl? Diane herself would jokingly attribute it to the benefits of cold morning baths and long horseback rides. Of course, a healthy lifestyle played a role, but it could not explain the miracle everyone witnessed. Here we approach the darkest and most dangerous part of her story. At court, there were always whispers about alchemists who secretly prepared certain elixirs for the all-powerful favorite. In those times, alchemy was a peculiar blend of science, magic, and outright charlatanism. In their retorts, these men tried to create not only the philosopher's stone, but also the drink of eternal youth. And Diane, being a pragmatic woman not prone to superstition, saw not magic in their experiments, but potential technology. What was in those vials she regularly took? What was the chemical composition of this beauty drink? The answer to this question would only be found 500 years later and would cast a new light on the famous paleness of her skin, which contemporaries considered a sign of aristocracy.
And so we come to the main, final question that ties all the others together. What was the price? For any exceptionalism, for any attempt to cheat time and nature, a price must always be paid. Power corrupts, but absolute power demands the sacrifice of more than just conscience. Eternal youth, bought not from the devil, but from an alchemist, might demand the most precious thing in payment: health. As we unravel the tapestry of Diane de Poitiers' life, we will follow not only her rise, but also how, with each new triumph, with each new dose of elixir, the invisible clock of destiny tallied the cost. This story is not just a biography of an influential favorite, it is an anatomy of ambition, a dissection of a legend, and a tragic narrative of how the pursuit of perfection can lead to self-destruction. We will take her life apart to understand who she truly was: a genius, a monster, or simply a victim of her own immeasurable grandeur. To find the roots of this tree of power, whose branches rose so high over France, one must dig deep into the very soil of her childhood. Diane was born in 1499, at the cusp of the grim Middle Ages and the nascent Renaissance. It was a time when old knightly ideals had already turned to dust, and new humanist values had not yet taken root. The world was ruled by cynical calculation and the law of the strongest, and little Diane learned these cruel laws from the first days of her life. Her first, and perhaps main teacher, was loss. At 6, she lost her mother, and this blow did not break her, but tempered her. The void left in her young soul was not filled with tears. It was filled with a cold, crystal-clear understanding. In this world, you are either a predator or prey. There is no third option. Her education only reinforced this conviction. The girl was entrusted to the upbringing of none other than Anne of Beaujeu, daughter of King Louis XI, who contemporaries nicknamed Madame Legrand for her intelligence and iron grip. Anne herself was a living example of what a woman could be if she cast aside the roles prescribed to her by society. For some time she was the de facto ruler of France, and the lessons she taught her ward had nothing to do with needlework and lute-playing. These were lectures on real politics. How to recognize weakness in an opponent, how to manipulate the vanity of the powerful, how to use rumors as a weapon, how to wear a mask of loyalty while harboring one's own plans in their heart. Diane proved to be a brilliant student. She absorbed this science of power like dry earth absorbs moisture.
But her nature demanded an outlet, not only for her mind, but also for her body. And she found this outlet in a completely unfeminine pursuit: hunting. Imagine the scene. A young aristocrat who should have been languishing in a castle with her embroidery instead races on horseback alongside men through the forests, pursuing game. She feared neither the thrill of the chase nor the sight of blood. Moreover, she observed with interest how the prey was butchered. This passion for hunting was not just entertainment, it was a training of her will. She learned to track, to corner, and to strike the decisive blow. Each stag brought down, each boar vanquished, was for her not just a trophy, but proof of her own superiority over wild, untamed force. This tempering, mental by Anne of Beaujeu, and physical in the forests of her family estates, created the Diane we know. Therefore, when at 15 she was passed off like an object to the 56-year-old nobleman Louis de Brezé, she did not wring her hands in despair. Unlike other girls of her time, she saw neither tragedy nor romance in this marriage. She saw it as a transaction. Her youth and beauty in exchange for status, position at court, and financial stability. She was not going to be an unhappy victim or a passionate lover. She was going to be an ideal partner. Diane meekly accepted her role, bore her husband 2 daughters, and plunged headfirst into managing his vast estates, displaying considerable administrative talent. Even then, she understood that money was the bloodline of power. She learned to manage finances, to multiply them, and this skill would serve her greatly in the future. The marriage to the old de Brezé became not a prison for her, but the final class in her harsh but effective school of life. She was ready to step onto the grand stage. And very soon, fate provided her with the opportunity to demonstrate everything she had learned.
For most women of that era, marriage, even to an elderly aristocrat, was the final point of their biography. Their further lives were reduced to bearing children and managing the household. But for Diane de Poitiers, this was only a prologue. She was the ideal wife, caring, thrifty, devoted. She bore Louis de Brezé 2 daughters, and their union appeared to be a model of family harmony from the outside. However, beneath this pious facade, cold pragmatism was already brewing. As historian Anatoly Lewandowski would later write, Diane learned her father's principle from youth. The future belongs to those who link their destiny with the prosperous and the strong. Her elderly husband was strong and influential, but he was mortal. Diane understood this and prepared for a future in which she would have to rely solely on herself. Meanwhile, as she played her role, malicious tongues at court began their work. Whispers circulated that the old de Brezé had long been incapable of having children, which meant the charming daughters were the fruit of someone else's help. No one believed in the fidelity of a young beauty living with a decrepit husband. These rumors were just the first shadow cast upon her reputation, but a real storm was soon to break. In 1522, a mortal threat loomed over the de Poitiers family. Diane's father, Jean de Poitiers, was implicated in a conspiracy against King Francis I. According to the laws of that time, treason against the crown was punishable by only one thing: the executioner's axe. The verdict was passed, and Jean was already preparing to ascend the scaffold.
And here, Diane stepped onto the grand stage of history for the first time. At that moment, she could have resigned herself, mourned her father, and retreated into obscurity. But she did the unthinkable. Using her beauty and position as a key, she secured an audience with the king himself. Imagine the scene. A young, dazzlingly beautiful woman, in tears, throws herself at the feet of the most powerful man in the country. She does not demand, she implores. She appeals not to the law, but to mercy. And a miracle occurred. Francis I, a known connoisseur of female beauty, was moved. The sentence was rescinded at the last moment. Diane's father was saved.
The court gasped. This had never happened before. Royal justice was unyielding, and such a pardon seemed extraordinary. And of course, an explanation was immediately born, simple and cynical. Her father's salvation was not a miracle, but a payment. Everyone was convinced that for this act of humanism, Diane had paid the king with the only currency she had, her body. Rumors of the beauty periodically sequestering herself with the monarch in his chambers spread throughout Paris. Even the Venetian ambassador, Lorenzo Contarini, a man well informed and not given to gossip, hinted in his dispatches that the young and beautiful Diane was loved and esteemed by King Francis I, and by common opinion by many others. Her reputation was destroyed. From a virtuous wife, she transformed in the eyes of the world into a calculating courtesan, ready to do anything to achieve her goals. But what is striking is that Diane did not try to justify herself. She acted as if she didn't notice these venomous whispers. She carried herself with such dignity and cold detachment that even the most malicious gossips were disarmed. Moreover, King Francis himself seemed utterly charmed by her unapproachability. Perhaps he was amused by this duality of her image. On the one hand, the reputation of an accessible beauty, and on the other, her personal demeanor, full of restraint and pride. He even ordered an ironic inscription to be made beneath her portrait, a beauty unattainable by seducers. Was it mockery, a compliment, or an acknowledgement of her uniqueness? We will never know. But Diane learned the main lesson from this story. She understood that public opinion is merely a tool. It can be managed, and that a scandalous reputation, if used correctly, can be a more powerful weapon than impeccable virtue. She would remember this lesson for the rest of her life. In 1531, Diane de Poitiers' orderly and dual life changed abruptly. Her elderly husband, Louis de Brezé, departed this world, leaving her a young, rich, and, most importantly, free widow. At 31, in the prime of her beauty, she gained full control of her destiny and fortune. For any other woman, this would have been the beginning of a new, bright chapter, full of balls, outfits, and the search for a new husband. But Diane did the exact opposite. She made a move that once again demonstrated her brilliant intuition for unconventional steps. She transformed her grief, whether genuine or feigned, into a powerful tool of self-presentation. Instead of removing her mourning attire, she made it her eternal uniform.
First, in memory of her deceased husband, she erected a luxurious mausoleum for him in Rouen Cathedral, a gesture that demonstrated her piety and loyalty. And then she dressed in black from head to toe. This was not just mourning, it was an image project thought out to the last detail. At a time when the royal court was drowning in a riot of colors, in scarlet velvet, gold brocade, and sapphire silk,
Diane appeared in society like a black comet against a colorful sky. Her austere, unadorned attire worked as a powerful contrast. It did not hide, but rather emphasized her dazzling white skin, her perfect figure, and her chiseled facial features. She was a living oxymoron. Mourning, which should have symbolized fading and sorrow, looked on her as a symbol of elegance, mystery, and unattainability. Over time, she allowed herself a slight relaxation, adding white to black. Thus was born her signature style, her personal emblem, recognized by all. Black and white outfits became her calling card. This achromatic palette was not just a choice of clothing, it was a declaration. It was as if she were saying to the whole world, "You are all bustling, colorful, ephemeral butterflies, but I am eternity. I am a marble statue among cheap painted dolls." This device worked flawlessly. She instantly stood out from the crowd of court ladies who, in their bright dresses, seemed indistinguishable from one another. The attention of men, tired of predictable gaudiness, was inevitably drawn to this mysterious, stern, and therefore even more desirable figure. She created an aura of exclusivity around herself. But it was not just aesthetics. This image also served several practical purposes. Firstly, it completely neutralized the rumors of her promiscuity. A woman in eternal mourning for her husband could by definition not be a frivolous adventurer. This was a powerful blow against her enemies. Secondly, this style allowed her to look younger. Bright colors often emphasize age-related changes, while the strict black and refreshing white created an illusion of timeless beauty. It was as if she had removed herself from the usual flow of time. Diane intuitively or consciously grasped one of the main laws of seduction. The most attractive is that which seems unattainable. With her image, she issued a challenge. She was a prize that one wanted to win. And very soon a man was found for whom this challenge became the endeavor of his life. She did not yet know that her black and white world was about to be illuminated by the light of royal love, and that her mourning for one man would become the beginning of her power over another.
The story of a great love, or more precisely, a great obsession, often begins with a seemingly insignificant episode. So it was this time. The first meeting between Diane de Poitiers and the future King Henry II was fleeting, but it left an indelible mark on the boy's soul. She was 26, he was only 7. That day was a day of national humiliation for France. King Francis I, having lost a war, was forced to give his 2 sons as hostages to the Spanish court to buy back his own freedom. Imagine the scene at the border, a lavish but sorrowful ceremony. 2 young princes, Francis and Henry, are torn from their family and handed over to foreign, hostile hands. The elder brother held stoically, but 7-year-old Henry was confused and frightened. In this commotion, where the adults were absorbed in state affairs and their own worries, no one paid attention to the frightened child. No one except Diane. She was just one of the court ladies, but her heightened sense of human vulnerability told her what to do. She approached the small, trembling prince, hugged him, and spoke a few simple, encouraging words. And then, as a farewell gesture, she kissed him on the forehead. It was a simple gesture of sympathy, of maternal tenderness, which meant absolutely nothing to her. But for Henry, this kiss became a revelation. In the world of cold court etiquette, where everything was subject to ritual, this simple human act of warmth and concern became an anchor for him, to which he clung with all his childish heart. As he later recalled, this kiss turned his entire life upside down.
For all the long 4 years spent in grim Spanish captivity, he carried in his memory the image of a beautiful, kind lady who was the only one to pity him at the most terrifying moment of his life. Diane became a myth, a dream, an ideal woman for him. When the grown-up but still very young Henry returned home, his childish adoration quickly grew into ardent youthful passion. The irony of fate was that it was Diane, as an experienced and intelligent lady, who was assigned to him as his mentor. She was to teach him courtly manners, give him lessons in etiquette. But the prince saw her not as a teacher. He saw her as a goddess descended from his childhood dreams. He showered her with ardent confessions, dedicated poems to her, and sought any opportunity to be near her. Diane, being an experienced woman and 20 years his senior, perfectly understood the nature of these feelings. She kept him at a distance, not taking the ardor of a teenager seriously. Moreover, she made a move that seemed destined to destroy his dreams forever. It was she who played a key role in choosing his bride, recommending her distant relative, the Italian Catherine de Medici, to the king.
This was a brilliant strategic move. Firstly, she showed her loyalty to the crown and her complete lack of personal ambition. Secondly, she chose a bride for Henry who, by all accounts, was inferior to her. The plain, slightly awkward, and very shy Catherine could not pose any competition. Diane had no intention of fighting for the prince's heart with a young rival. She intended to remain the one and only in his life. And her calculation paid off. The marriage not only did not cool Henry's feelings, but intensified them. Now, against the backdrop of his dull and boring wife, the image of the beautiful, intelligent, and unattainable Diane shone even brighter for him. He did not hide his feelings. At knightly tournaments, he competed under her colors, black and white. He bowed his banner before her, which was a public and bold declaration of love. The court whispered, Catherine suffered, and Diane waited. She knew her time had not yet come. Henry was only the second son, not the heir. But in 1536, the sudden death of his elder brother Francis dramatically changed the entire political landscape. Not yet 20 years old, Henry became the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. And then Diane realized the hour had struck. Now her admirer possessed real future power, and she finally allowed him to turn his dreams into reality, entering into a relationship that would change the history of France. The death of the old King Francis I in 1547 was not an end, but a dawn for Diane de Poitiers. Her protégé, her admirer, her creation, Henry II, ascended the French throne. And on the very day of the coronation, all of France, the entire European world, saw who had truly become the mistress of the kingdom. While the legitimate queen, Catherine de Medici, watched the ceremony modestly from a distant tribune, like a poor relative, Diane de Poitiers occupied the most honorable place next to the new monarch. This was not merely a display of affection, it was a public declaration of power. Henceforth, her word was law, her will was state policy. The shadow reign had ended. The era of Diane had begun.
The influence she acquired was practically boundless. It permeated all spheres of the country's life. Henry, blinded by his years of love, made not a single decision, however insignificant, without consulting her. He spent his mornings not with ministers, but in her chambers, where state affairs were discussed over breakfast. Diane became the unofficial prime minister. She decided who would be given a position and who would be sent into exile. First, she carried out a total purge of the court. All the favorites of the previous monarch, all the old nobles and officials who could compete with her or show disloyalty, were ruthlessly removed. In their place, she appointed her own people, those who owed their rise to her and were therefore absolutely devoted. She created her own hierarchy of power, which culminated personally in her. The king showered her with gifts that were astounding. Envious individuals who, behind her back, called her an old mushroom, had to grind their teeth watching the best castles in France fall into her hands, including the fairy tale Château de Chenonceau, which she took from the crown. She was granted the title Duchess of Valentinos, which placed her on par with the highest blood aristocracy. She received income from new taxes and controlled appointments to ecclesiastical positions. Her wealth became comparable to the treasury of a small European state. But Diane was not just a greedy mistress. She actively intervened in high politics, and here her influence was not so unambiguous. She was intelligent and insightful, but her knowledge of international relations was superficial. Driven by personal likes and dislikes, she gave the king advice that was sometimes detrimental to France. The most striking example of such a mistake was her decision to push Henry to resume the war with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. This conflict, which depleted the treasury and claimed thousands of lives, ended in a crushing defeat for France. The country was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty and abandon its long-standing claims in Italy. This catastrophe revealed the flip side of her omnipotence. When one person, even the most intelligent, gains absolute control over the monarch, their personal whims and errors can turn into a national tragedy. But even this failure did not shake her position. Henry still saw her as the source of wisdom and light. He trusted her unconditionally, and this blind faith was both her greatest triumph and a potential threat to the entire kingdom. She sat at the pinnacle of the world she had created for herself, not yet knowing that the foundation of this world rested on the life of just one man.
The strangest and perhaps the most humiliating aspect of Henry II's reign for his contemporaries was the relationship within the royal family. It was not simply a love triangle. It was a stable, legalized system where the legitimate spouse played not the leading role, but the mistress. And the most astonishing thing was how the two main women in the king's life appeared. Catherine de Medici, Queen of France, was almost 20 years younger than her rival. By all laws of nature, she should have shone with youth and freshness. But next to her eternally young, slender, and radiant rival, Catherine looked like what she was, a tormented, insecure, and unhappy woman. Contemporaries ruthlessly compared the charming Diane to the ungainly goose Catherine. This contrast was a daily, public humiliation for the queen. Henry, consumed by his passion, did not notice or did not want to notice his wife's suffering. He openly neglected her, spending all his time with Diane. He often declared to his beloved that he did not even wish to visit his wife's chambers, considering it a tedious and unpleasant duty. And here Diane displayed not just feminine wisdom, but a truly state-level foresight. She perfectly understood that without heirs, the Valois dynasty, and therefore the power of her beloved Henry, would be under threat. The stability of the throne was the guarantee of her own well-being. And therefore, she, the mistress, took on the role of family psychologist and strict mentor.
She literally forced the king to fulfill his marital duty. According to court recollections, she personally escorted Henry to the Queen's bedroom, giving him final instructions. It was a surreal, almost absurd picture, a lover making sure her man did not forget his wife for the sake of the future state. These joint efforts, strangely enough, were successful. After 10 years of childless marriage, when everyone considered Catherine infertile, she finally began to give birth. One after another, she gave France 10 children, including 3 future kings. Diane personally attended the births, taking the newborn heirs into her hands among the first. It was as if she were demonstrating to everyone that this was also her achievement, her project. She did not just allow the queen to give birth, she oversaw this process, strengthening the dynasty that sustained her power. The relationship between the two women was a model of icy politeness. They never quarreled publicly. They exchanged pleasantries, appeared together on official ceremonies, creating the illusion of harmony. But beneath this mask, a quiet, deep-seated hatred seethed.
Catherine endured. She was intelligent and knew that an open conflict with the all-powerful favorite would only lead to our own complete ruin. She chose the tactic of long, agonizing waiting. She meekly accepted her humiliating role, but in her soul she harbored resentment and a thirst for revenge. Many years later, already a powerful queen mother, she confessed in her memoirs, revealing the true nature of their relationship. She wrote, "I always welcomed Madame de Valentinos warmly, but I always made it clear to her that it was a pretense, for a loving wife would never love her husband's mistress." This phrase is the quintessence of her years of suffering. She smiled at Diane, knowing that one day her hour would come. She waited for fate or death to deprive her rival of her main support, the king's love. And that day was not far off. Power built on the feelings of one single person, however strong, is as fragile as glass. It can shatter at any moment from an accidental blow. For Diane de Poitiers, this fatal blow sounded on a summer day, June 30th, 1559. A lavish nightly tournament was held in Paris in honor of the wedding of the king's daughter. Henry II, a passionate admirer of such contests, decided to personally participate. He had already won several victories and, encouraged by his success, decided to fight one more time, despite the Queen's pleas and bad omens. His opponent was a young Scottish guardsman, the Count de Montgomery. And this time, luck turned away from the king. The Scotsman's lance broke against Henry's helmet, and a sharp fragment, piercing through the visor, plunged directly into his eye, penetrating deep into his brain. The king, still alive but mortally wounded, was carried to his chambers. And at that very moment, as he fell from his horse, Diane de Poitiers' all-powerful empire began to crumble. While Europe's best doctors tried in vain to save the monarch, a quiet but swift coup began in the palace, and it was led by the one who had been waiting for her hour for decades, Queen Catherine de Medici. Her mask of humility and submissiveness was shed. From the shadows emerged another woman, a cold, calculating, and ruthless ruler. First, she took complete control of access to the dying king. Diane, who had spent her entire life by his side, was forbidden even to approach his room. She found herself isolated, cut off from the source of her power.
Catherine acted quickly and decisively. She did not wait for her husband to breathe his last. She struck when he was still alive, but already helpless. The queen sent a messenger to Diane with a short and humiliating order to immediately leave Paris and return all the jewels gifted to her by the king to the treasury. This was not just an order, it was public degradation. Catherine was not just taking away wealth, she was erasing Diane from history, depriving her of the symbols of her former grandeur. Imagine Diane's state at that moment. Her entire world, built with such effort, was collapsing before her eyes. She was alone, defenseless, surrounded by enemies who yesterday had fawned over her. But even at this moment of complete collapse, Diane de Poitiers did not lose her pride. When the messenger delivered the Queen's order, she listened to him with icy calm and asked only one question, in which resounded all her past power and present despair. "Is the king already dead?" "No, madame," replied the messenger, "but he will not live until morning." And then Diane straightened up and uttered a phrase that became her last act of defiance, her farewell challenge to the new mistress of France. "In that case," she retorted, "as long as my sovereign is alive, no one dares to command me." It was a gesture of incredible courage and desperate loyalty. She refused to recognize Catherine's authority as long as the one who was everything to her breathed. But it was only a postponement. She understood perfectly that as soon as Henry's heart stopped, her own story would be over. The battle was lost. It remained only to accept defeat with dignity. On July 10, 1559, King Henry II's heart stopped, and with his last breath, the era of Diane de Poitiers set. The news of the king's departure became her sentence. There was no longer room for pride and disobedience. With icy dignity, she carried out the will of the new ruler. She packed her belongings, returned every last pearl of the jewels gifted by the king, and without a word left the court that had been her empire for over a decade. She retreated to her Château d'Anne, an architectural marvel that she herself had built during her years of triumph. There, away from intrigues and bustle, she spent the last years of her life in solitude and peace, surrounded by nature and the ghosts of the past.
Shortly before her death, she was visited by the chronicler Pierre de Bourdelle, Signor de Brantôme, who was utterly amazed by her appearance. At 65, Diane, according to him, looked as fresh and beautiful as a woman in her 30s. In conversation with him, she herself revealed part of her secret, not of beauty, but of success with the king. With the wisdom of a woman who had lived an incredible life, she told Brantôme, "Every man seeks in a woman, first of all, a mother, and only then a lover." In this simple phrase lay the key to her psychological power over Henry. She was not just his passion, but his refuge, his mentor, that maternal figure he had been deprived of in his childhood. This was the final confession of a brilliant strategist of human souls. But what about the other secret? The secret of her eternal youth, which so amazed her contemporaries. For centuries, the explanation oscillated between two versions. Either she possessed exceptional genetics and lived a healthy lifestyle, or she was a sorceress. Diane herself promoted the first version: early rising, cold baths, long horseback rides. Undoubtedly, these habits helped her maintain her figure and energy. However, they could not fully explain the miracle that everyone witnessed. The real answer, much darker and more astonishing, waited for almost 500 years, and modern science helped to find it. In 2008, a team of French scientists had the opportunity to study the remains of Diane de Poitiers. The analysis of her hair and bone tissue yielded a shocking discovery. The gold content in her body exceeded the norm by 250 times. Suddenly, all the court rumors about alchemists and their elixirs took on a new, sinister meaning. Everything indicated that Diane, in her pursuit of eternal beauty,
regularly took a certain drink containing colloidal gold particles. In those times, it was believed that gold, the noblest of metals, could stop aging. What Diane and her alchemists did not know is that gold is a heavy metal, and its accumulation in the body is toxic. The famous paleness of her skin, considered a sign of aristocracy in her youth and becoming almost unearthly in old age, was most likely a symptom of severe chronic anemia caused by slow, gradual poisoning by the very elixir that was supposed to grant her eternal life. In the end, Diane de Poitiers paid the highest price for her beauty. She did not sell her soul to the devil. She gave her health to flawed science, becoming a tragic victim of her own immeasurable desire to be perfect.